I think we'll get started. It's about 5 after 11, and I'd like to conclude by noon. So um, I'd like for us just to be silent. You can maybe start the recording.
It's going.
Thank you. So I invite you to breathe in, and breathe out. Breathe in through your nose and exhale through your mouth. Breathe in deeply, noticing that God is within. Breathe out through your mouth, noticing that God is all around. In the silence before time began, in the quiet of the womb, in the stillness of early morning is your beauty. At the heart of all creation, at the birth of every creature, at the center of each moment is your splendor. Rekindle in us the sparks of your beauty, that we may be part of the splendor of the moment. Rekindle in us the sparks of your beauty, that we may be part of the blazing splendor that burns from the heart of this moment. We'll begin today with Christ in My Heart. It's sung in Gaelic. So I have one of the verses here for you to read as you hear the music and the words. I thought it would be good as we begin today just to review the first part of the book, which is Ancient Harmony. And thought I'd share three different pieces with you. Chapter 1 was Every Bush is Burning, which is to pay attention that all of life is filled with God. And so the quote is from Irenaeus. The whole of creation flows forth from the very substance of God. Chapter 2, title was Outbursts of Singularity. It's an interesting concept. And Newell uses Abraham Heschel's quote to speak to that. Whether in the East or the West, we are being invited to recover the balance between unity and individuality. We need to know that all things are interwoven and that each strand in the tapestry is holy. Our distinct races, wisdom traditions, men and women of every race are outbursts of singularity, each one carrying within them the life of the one. In chapter 3, the title was Keep on Remembering that God is at the heart of every moment. Remembering that spirit and matter belong together. Rabbi Heschel calls it radical amazement, which is the true understanding. And he shares the story of the Rebbe and a young Jewish boy in the river. And the Rebbe says, the river that flows before will never flow this way again. And the boy fell asleep. And when he awoke, he was the only boy in the river with the Rebbe. The Rebbe was holding him up. And the Rebbe said nothing. And his face was an icon that opened to the divine. And here we have an icon of Mary and the child. So today we move into the second part of his book, which is called Broken Harmony, the Broken Harmony. Two individuals that I'd like to introduce you to today are Julian of Norwich. And Julian was from England. I don't know if it was called England at that time, but here I have a portion of the picture of England, the center portion. And up in here, you'll see Norfolk. And Norwich is right to the eastern part in this area here of Norwich, which is close to the sea. You'll see it used to be a port city right around here. She was known as Dame Julian, Lady Juliana of Norwich, identified as a Christian mystic and anchoress, best known for her work, Revelations of Divine Love. Julian's own title was Showings, meaning how God showed oneself. Almost nothing is known of her life since, as an anchoress, a woman who lives in seclusion dedicated wholly to God, she would have been disinclined to discuss details of whatever previous life she led in the world. Even her actual name is unknown. Julian of Norwich, the name came from St. Julian's Church in Norwich, England. Another person I'd like you to meet today is Etty Hillesum. Etty Hillesum was a young Jewish woman who lived and died under the Nazi reign of terror in Holland. She became one who at first would visit people who came to Westport in Holland, and they were housed there till they were shipped, interesting word there, to one of the death camps. She wrote in her diary that one needs to look things straight in the face, even the worst crimes. So I thought what might be good as we start today is to talk about what Noel O'Donoghue, a Carmelite mystic, said, which is spoken at the first of the chapter. Life being a gift, but a gift shrouded in pain. So I'd like to open this up to the discussion about what that might mean for you as you think about that quote. Life being a gift, and yet a gift shrouded in pain.
Well, as I remember in the Book of Joy, I think the Dalai Lama talks about this subject, because one of the central ideas in Buddhism, of course, is to how do you live with pain? How do you avoid unnecessary pain? And it also reminds me what my doctor said to me quite a few years ago. Say, pain is what it costs. It's the ticket, the price of admission to get into life. So learning to fit into the Creator's plan, which seems to involve pain for everyone, and learning to accept that and to find joy, to counterbalance that, how to use pain, handle it as best we can. I find dealing with pain is very important.
Thank you, Clark. Anyone else?
I really resonate with that quote, because I believe that it is a gift, that our pain and suffering is a way in which we receive that gift. And for me, I really like that quote your doctor said, that pain is the ticket to get into life. I was thinking about how suffering and pain that we might go through, the ways in which we live into it, the ways it's the place where God can reach us often, because we get to a place where we need or realize we need to listen to Him, but also that energy from our pain or our suffering is also a way that we might connect into the pain and suffering around us, either close around us or in our global community, and open us up to be able to connect in with that pain and move that energy into whatever way God might use us in that. It might be prayer if we're not able to be a part of other groups that might work for healing and easing of pain in the world. But I really like that idea of it's a ticket into life, because it really opens up life to us in a way that I don't think we get when everything is just a rosy picture.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment?
I guess I'll jump in. I'll say, in Buddhism, as my dad mentioned, one of the central tenets is this idea that life is suffering. And the idea is that's because we grow attached to things that are temporary in this world. And so, so pain is certainly the admission to life. And as Carol said, there's a relational aspect to pain. And at the end of the day, I think Buddhism is right? We experience pain because we want to hold on to things that are temporary. And I think Jesus teaches us that that's not necessarily a bad thing, that as much as pain is the admission to life, pain is also the admission to love.
Amen.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, I do think that that's very wise to realize that in seeing how we can help relieve other people's pain, that is a counter agent to our own pain. We find joy if we can rejoice that we are relieving someone else's pain. I think we feel less isolated, less radically alone, as Newell would, I'm sure, point out, if we do reach out to others. The story you're going to talk now about the woman in Holland and how the people were on their way to the death camp and someone slipped a file to him and he was able to cut through the bars on the window in the prison car on the train, and they were able to jump out and be saved. That's a great joy. I just feel something instinctive about being able to help people like that.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Pain also allows us to feel relief and joy when the pain eases.
There may be other things that you have to share, but we'll move on. Thank you, those who shared and those who are holding what they wanted to share. It's perhaps an invitation for us all to grow. Newell shares, there is an ancient harmony that is within the matter of the universe. All beings carry within themselves the sound of the one, but the gift of life's essential harmony is broken. So he's placing into tension this reality that we experience. I connected this with John 1:10, where the writer says, Jesus was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. So Eddie Hillison's invitation was to look suffering straight in the face. And so I have a picture here of Jewish people being placed onto cattle cars that were leaving Westport and going most likely to Poland, where they would be, lives would be gassed, and then their bodies would be incinerated. Harmony and brokenness. Both are within us. Life's essential harmony is within each of us, and so is life's brokenness. Brokenness is shown clearly when we return hatred for hatred. Newell says to be part of transformation is to look falseness in the face, to passionately name it and denounce it in the world, and at the same time to clearly identify the shadow in our hearts and do battle there. I think that's truly the invitation. We all know what it's like to react. Our reptilian brain has gifted us with that. And there's some goodness about that because we can protect ourselves. And the greater invitation, however, is that when we see falseness, when we see how inhumane people can be with one another, we are invited to identify that shadow in our hearts and do battle there. This is a picture of our dear friend John Lewis as he crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge so many years ago. I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about knowing and naming brokenness. For it's the essential in our journey toward wholeness. We will not arrive, but we will move closer. We will not be well by denying the wrongs that we carry within us as nations and religions and communities. We will not be well, as Julian of Norwich invites us to, if we downplay them or maybe project them onto others. So here's some wrongs that I have wanted to lift up. Since 9/11, the wars and skirmishes that we've been involved in, there has been displacement of around 37 million people, mostly who are children and women. The countries I identify are Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. I tell you, I'm just delighted that Pope Francis is in Iraq today. I saw a Roman Catholic friend last week and I shared that with her. I said, I just am delighted that in the midst of a time when we would, I'm sure everyone who talked with him said, you should not go. And he's there. And so my invitation for us is to, as a community, what do we name as things that we notice in our life experience that are wrongs that we wish to face? Anyone want to speak to that?
I would like to. I've been really disturbed by what is happening about homelessness, especially close to home in Chico. I do know that there are some places in the country where they have lovingly and kindly found some way to help the homeless, not just to fix them, but to help them to become a useful part of the community again. But in Chico, I'm just really dismayed by things that are happening. But I also want to say I'm very pleased that the editor of the Enterprise record is starting today, I think, to tell the story of some of the homeless in Chico, to make them real people to us. Thank you.
Anyone else like to lift up any wrong that they want to face?
I would.
Well, this is a topic that we've been hearing a lot about, and that I just infuriated, I must say, that they're talking about we live in a post-truth age where people are demagogues, dictators, feel that, or they realize that they have power. People don't know what's true. And so they tell lies in order to abuse, to take power and use it to inflict suffering on other people. There needs to be some way found where there are consequences for telling dangerous lies. And it doesn't seem that we're getting much of a concerted effort in this country to correct the situation that could lead us into what we've been going through in the last 3 or 4 years.
I would like to name what I read this past week that was very disturbing and emotional to me, and that is the attacks all across the United States of Asian Americans. And I did read a beautiful article, only one, but at least it was just one, that spoke about how neighbors of an Asian American family had set up chairs in their yard to watch over them and protect them from anyone coming to their home to attack them. And I thought, well, there is beauty in suffering like this, and it's just very disturbing that we have that happening all across the United States.
Thank you.
Bill,
Yes.
this is Carl Johnson. I've got a couple of things that haven't been mentioned so far. Number one is the hunger that occurs in some of these nations, and particularly when the children aren't fed and there's food available, but the people in leadership positions tend to deny that they get a distribution of food. And that has always been one thing that I wanted to ask God, why do we have that happen when we have the food available? Okay, number two, and this has to do with the people that have been in the armed forces, is post-traumatic stress. I think that some of these people, they've seen what happens in conflict and how that wears on their souls and what upsets them. And in particular, I would say the medics that have to deal with the broken parts and keeping people alive to get them back and seeing what happens to them. Now, I know that this is slightly different than we've been talking locally or in the United States, but I'm just, that's more of my viewpoint, having been in the armed forces and also have been working in a situation of providing food that is available to this going overseas.
Thank you, Carl. Anyone else?
Yes, I'd like to name the scourge of violence that's inflicted on our brothers and sisters of color, and the systems that continue to support people in power, so that the violence against them is not brought to justice.
Amen.
I'd piggyback on my wife and name how this pandemic has disproportionately killed people of color, and yet the vaccines are disproportionately going to white folks.
I'm sure we have more to share, but I would like to move on. In some ways, we've been talking about the slaughter of innocents. Earlier, we talked about the descent of the spirit, which is this sculpture that you see here. Notice the lamb at the bottom of the sculpture. Initially, the lamb was not in the sculpture. It was added when his art was destroyed in a fire in New York. And it is a recognition that in life we experience suffering. This sculpture invites us to remember the essential oneness and holiness of life, and at the same time, not to turn our faces away from the 15,000 children who die every day from hunger-related disease. The innocent are vulnerable. The good suffer. In some ways, it gets at what you were talking about, Carl. We've all lifted that up. And while it is indeed true that the pandemic has taken more lives of older people in the United States, I don't know what the statistics are in other countries. And we have this Saint Julian of Norwich, who we've talked about, a Christian mystic from the 14th century. She's known for the quote, "All shall be well, all shall be well. In all manner of things, all shall be well." And she talks about three essential kinds of knowledge: to know the one from whom all things come, to know ourselves, and that all of life comes from the one, and to know our sinfulness and separateness from the one. Eddie Hillesum invites us to look separateness and suffering straight in the face. The image of a bird needing two wings to fly. We need to be able to speak both yes and no in our lives. Our lives come from the one, and yet we are separated from the one. The secrets of family, what we hold in our bodies. John Philip Newell talks about his grandfather, James Newell. He found about him in Canada when he became involved in politics, when he lived there quite a few years ago. His family had called his grandfather a scallywag, someone who behaves badly. But he says he was more than that. He was also a man of passionate vision. We carry in ourselves both the brokenness that we have and our desire for wholeness. So the question becomes one of how do we attend to the pains that we live with? John Philip Newell talks about a shoulder pain he had a Reiki therapist attend to. And so she invited him to think of a family member where there's a painful memory with whom he could be in silence. And so he thought of his grandfather, the one I just spoke of. And he began to look with more kindness toward his grandfather. And at the same time, with more kindness toward his shoulder pain. There's some books that I've been reading recently that I wanted to share with you today. You may be familiar with them, you may not be. But one of the things they get at is what I think is important for us as we look to our present discussion. The one is My Grandmother's Hands. That's a story about how we engage racism in our country. And the author proposes that we are not going to be able to address this cognitively, but rather by engaging it as a form of trauma. And so he looks at the trauma of people of color, particularly Black people who were slaves, come from slave families. He looks at it from the privilege of white people and their trauma in relationship to that. And he looks at it from the trauma of police and engage it not cognitively, but rather through experience. And in some ways gets at John Phillips Newell experience with a Reiki therapist as he experienced the healing touch, inviting to look lovingly at his grandfather, and then how he looked more kindly at his own pain. Another book that I'm just beginning to read is After Whiteness, which is more a book that addresses how we are teaching theological people in this day and age. I don't have a lot to share with you about it, but I find it very insightful as it looks at the same experience of trauma. And then the last is written by a psychiatrist, The Body Keeps the Score, which addresses a comparison between veterans from World War I and veterans from the Vietnam War and the difference of that. These books move us to engage our reality in a way that listens to the body. They infer that we will not move forward as long as we resist this way. The mind is an important processor. The body remembers. If you go back to chapter 3 of this book, Newell talks about remembering. Eddie Hillesum says, I'm hungry I am with the hungry, with the ill-treated and the dying every day. But I am also with the jasmine and with the peace of the sky beyond my window. It is a question of living life from minute to minute and taking suffering into the bargain. Are we open to truly talk about looking at suffering straight in the face? That's the question I invite us to ponder together now.
Well, I've often wondered to what extent we can, in a healthy way, withstand constantly thinking about every suffering, every type of problem in the world. And some people who say that watching the news constantly, where everything bad anywhere in the world has been dragged in to make you feel upset. Is this the most beneficial way to look suffering straight in the face? How much time, what percent, what part of ourselves should be dedicated to thinking about what's wrong, and what part should we spend finding joy in beauty, in friendship, and doing what we can to help relieve suffering?
I notice I'm much more willing to look at suffering that I can't do anything about than suffering that I can do something about.
Good point.
Carl, I muted you. You have to unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted now?
There you go.
Yes, thank you, Carl. Thanks for noticing that, Ben.
What I would like to have Bill and both of you have had to deal with people who are suffering either from dying and the process of dying, or have having a traumatic event happen in a family which is not expected. For example, the father or our mother killed in an auto accident caused by a drunk driver, something on this altitude. We have older people that they've been able to live a full life. It's nice to be living. But I would like to have, if you have any insights, or where you've had to have had some training in dealing with these people and these emotions. So did I put you on the spot? I shouldn't have asked that question.
No, you want to go for it, Bill?
Every experience is new. I think that if I were to be honest with you, I would share with you that one tends, or not one, I'll speak for myself. I tended in my own experience to put up or surround myself with defenses, not to react to what was going on, but protected my own feelings of loss that came forward, which I think is part of the role that a clergy plays. And yet sometimes it creates a hardness that's not really as helpful. So that's a confession I would make to you. I think there are ways that one learns how to move beyond that. But sometimes that keeps you from looking at suffering like Ben talked about. That you tend to look at that which you can't do anything about rather than looking more locally. One of the things that I would want to also say that part of looking at suffering, the invitation, at least what Newell gives us in his book, is to notice the suffering that happens and then to be drawn to look within at your own suffering that you've not attended to. So I think that to create that tension, I think I would suggest is critical as we consider, looking suffering straight in the face. It's not just to solve an issue, but it's to look within yourself and to ask what you have avoided looking at. That's enough.
I would follow up. I very much agree with everything Bill has said. And I would just add that, yeah, when confronted with those situations of grief and suffering, like you described, Carl, of an unexpected and tragic death, the only thing I have found I can do in those situations is just to be present with the person in their grief and to bear witness to that suffering and to let them know I see it. I think it really goes back to this theme that we're hearing today of being willing to look suffering straight on. And as Bill said, it's a hard thing to do. And I think in order to be willing to truly come face to face with someone else's suffering, we do have to take time and address the suffering that we have experienced, so that when we look at someone else's suffering, we don't get distracted and turn to looking at our own.
Now, Bill, today in our discussion here, we were talking about a parable about someone who had suffered great loss and turned to a religious leader for comfort. And the leader said, you can be healed by a mustard seed, but it must be a mustard seed that you will be given by a family that has never suffered great loss and provoking great grief. So you must go door to door until you find that family. And so the person did go door to door and of course could not find a single family that had not suffered a grievous loss. And so realizing that this is the nature of the human condition, we all suffer, and feeling compassion for those people, then the person was able to take the body of the loved one who had died and bury it in the forest and be at peace.
Yes.
I find that in my own personal suffering, I am, by the way, legally blind, and I had a guide dog who I lost during this pandemic. And it was a very painful experience for me because during this time, I couldn't have someone hold me or hug me or touch me because of the situation we all have found ourselves in. What I found about myself was that I had to be totally present with my own suffering and grief. And there were many times I meditated to be as close to God as I possibly could. And I also found that what helped me during this suffering was listening and being within nature. Because I feel like in many things I've read in the past, especially with people in the Holocaust and the terrible suffering they went through, they always found something to focus on to keep them going. And I think nature was a part of that, because now when I hear birds sing in the morning and I think of my precious Nana who I've lost, she is somewhere in that bird song. And that brings me great joy.
Thank you.
I've got something I would like to share. Some of you know, and some of you don't know, that when I was growing up from the 7th grade to as a sophomore in junior college, my mother died from Hoskins, and there was no cure for it at that time. And you grow up and you grow up in a hurry. And you know, the one thing that when she passed away, I felt a loss. By the same token, I did not want to see her do any more of the suffering she had to suffer. And there's one more addendum I'd like to add to this. Faye and I are convinced that my mother has been a part of our marriage for the whole 52 years. She's been here in some type of a spirit and always has been a part of it.
I invite us to be in silence with what we've shared. And for those of you who didn't share, hold what you have in your own heart in silence. I'd like to close with a poem by Maya Angelou. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied. So he opens his throat to sing A caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade winds soft through the signing trees. And the fat worm's waiting on a dawn bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, where the caged bird sings of freedom. Well, thank you for coming today. Next week, we continue with chapter 5, which is digging God out.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, wonderful, Bill.
Have a good day. Blessings.
Thank you, Bill. And I'd like to introduce my friend Meredith, who is, wave your hand.